you. Welcome back, everybody, after the break. I'm pleased to introduce Jean-Pierre Hubaux, the moderator for this high-level panel on how to build digital trust going forward. Jean-Pierre is the full professor at EPFL and the head of the Laboratory for Data Security. He trained at EPFL a lot of promising and very intelligent students like myself. And besides that, he pioneered the area of privacy and security in mobile wireless networks and in personal health too. He's the academic director of the Center for Digital Trust, leads the data protection in personalized health project funded by the ETH Council, and is a co-chair of the data security stream of Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. He is among the most cited researchers in privacy protection and in information security. Jean-Pierre?
Okay, thanks a lot, Olivier. Merci beaucoup. And welcome everyone to this high-level panel, and welcome after this long day for still being with us. Having been introduced myself, I now feel entitled to introduce my panelists. And I'll do this alphabetically, which will allow me to start with the gender minority, right? So our first panelist is John Frank, who is actually Microsoft Vice President, focusing notably on UN affairs. And I should say that Microsoft is one of the partners of C4DT. So John leads actually the team that focuses on deepening Microsoft's engagement with the UN and international organizations. André Kudelski is chairman and CEO of Kudelski Group. Kudelski is one of the founding partners of C4DT. Now, André Kudelski has several hats. He's also president of InnoSwiss, which, as we all know, is a Swiss Federal Agency for Innovation. He's also vice chairman of the Swiss American Chamber of Commerce, and he sits on the strategy advisory board of EPFL. And André Kudelski is actually an alumnus of EPFL, where he studied the physics. Then, Nele Leosk is actually the ambassador at large from a country that is well known for many things, but including notably for its, let's say, fast digitalization, Estonia. And she's responsible for the development and coordination of digital diplomacy and for global partnerships in digital domain. And over the past years, she has worked in a number of, let's say, has actually provided advice to a number of governments and large corporations. Ursula Oesterle, on the other side, is actually she joined EPFL recently as a vice president of for innovation. And before that, she spent 20 years in Silicon Valley and Asia working in open innovation with startups. And Ursula is also an alum of EPFL. She got a PhD in physics. And last but not least, Niniane Paeffgen is managing director at the Swiss Digital Initiative, SDI, foundation. And one of the projects they are leading is a project I know well, which is the Swiss Digital Trust Label. She's a member of the WEF Global Shapers Community, the Swiss think tank on foreign policy called Hubaux, that I know well, and the Davos Digital Council. So thanks for being with us, and we have 1 hour and a half to talk about, let's say further, explore the topic of digital trust. And I will start with a few general questions, but at any point in time, I would encourage, once we are done with let's say, with the bootstrap, the participants in the audience, be it in the room or remotely, to intervene and share their comments or questions. I trust, Michael, you are going to relay, you are going to be the proxy for the, let's say, online audience. So thank you very much for doing so. So now, first question. And I'll ask Nele maybe to respond to this as a first speaker. And I've actually encouraged the speakers to be as I'm an engineer by training, so I tend to be a very pragmatic person, and I'm somewhat a bit, lost when being in Geneva, talking at the level of abstraction that is usually the case here. So I encouraged all our panelists to be as precise as possible in their responses, and especially to provide, let's say, concrete examples from their own experience, be it personally or from their own organizations. And yeah, I'm very much looking forward to see how they perform on that front. So having said that, my dear Nele, so what are the main challenges your organization is facing? And when I say your organization, it can be the government, but you can also take it more generally, say the country as such. Estonia famously had to endure cyber attacks from another country in the past, and so this is also an experience that certainly has brought lessons, important lessons to the country. So what are essentially the challenges and in terms also in the way you perceive the service you're providing to your own citizens?
Thank you. I am also a port engineer by my first training, so I believe combined with being Estonian, we will have a very strict time scheduling. But of course, coming from Estonia and representing my country, I will try to see the general problems that Estonia and the Estonian government is facing. But before going to these challenges, I would perhaps like to simply get back to our day and the discussions that we had today, and see really what it is a digital trust. And we have talked a lot about privacy and security and how to handle different risks that digitalization comes along with. But we cannot forget that this sort of basics of digitalization, that our systems and data are complied with certain standards, that we have security mechanisms in place. This is not something that may necessarily help to create a trust among the public. Because public wants services, they want solutions, they want virtual life where they feel comfortable, where their services are user-friendly, that they need them, it's easy to use, and that takes a lot more than just securing your information systems and data. So this comes actually to the really big challenge. It is the capacity of our government, but also private sector, to really provide these services that people need. And it has always been this issue that we start providing services from the viewpoint from the government or from the viewpoint from a certain other partner, but not necessarily the end user. And this, of course, is related to the second aspect of the interrelated matter, and this is related to user experience. Because trust does not happen overnight. It means that we as governments need to provide these services over time, consistently, and across sectors. And an example here is the famous internet voting, which is currently going on in Estonia because we have local elections on Sunday. In 2005, when we first piloted it, the infrastructure, the readiness from both government and public side was there. We were used to using our digital identity, we were used to using digital services. Still, only 0.8% of people voted via the internet, which shows that even though we are used to digitalization, something new comes and it takes time. So last time when we had elections in 2019, almost 50% of voters voted via the internet. Despite these hacks that had happened in between, and these that you were referring to have not been the only hacks. Hacks will always happen. They have happened, and probably it will also increase in the future, considering the increasing polarization and many other issues. But this comes to also down to how we as governments are used to developing digitalization. We have units for security, we have somebody providing that area service, somebody providing the other area service. Then we have units that deal with democracy, that deal with transparency, participation, But for people, it doesn't matter. They see one virtual room and they do not matter. They don't care whether it's the internet voting or whether it's paying taxes or whether it's participatory budgeting. For them, one experience influences the other. So which means that the government has to provide sort of level of openness in everything it does, a certain capacity and digital level in all the services across the sectors. But increasingly, of course, what we also discussed today here is that the borders between public and private sector are also diminishing. And one of the factors why sort of Estonia managed to get people to digital was the shared responsibility between the private sector and public sector. For example, our digital identity is provided by the government but used by private sector. Also the data sharing layer is the same. And we see that these borders are getting blurrier and blurrier. And we talked quite a bit about fake news, media content that is driving anger, hatred, conflict. And we cannot forget that this same content may actually influence public attitude towards government digitalization. And this has, of course, put my role higher in the agenda because digital technologies transcend borders. And it is also our task to build these partnerships, not only with other governments, but also with private sector, to guarantee that this digital development is democratic. And we will hear later of the colleagues.
Thanks a lot, Nele, for this introductory contribution. So, who would like to let's say, respond to this also with a different perspective? Maybe André, what do you think in your own perception of the problem? So we have talked about the fact, and we were also actually discussing even right before this panel, the fact that trust in technology is something that is absolutely key to overcome the current challenges, right? And the COVID crisis is a wonderful worldwide experience. And Switzerland, for some reason, doesn't fare particularly well, actually, on that challenge, we have to admit. So it would be interesting to hear from your point of view how you see this, but also from the point of view of you as a provider of solutions, how do you see the path forward?
So first, I would like to start by one point. Trust is something that is absolutely essential in life. And for me, digital trust is just one illustration and example of how trust can be handled. And I would just like to take one specific example, is also the story of the COVID crisis. Few people were thinking that the COVID crisis was just first a health crisis or a classical economical crisis, but fundamentally it has been a structural crisis where a lot of elements have changed. And one of the key differences that we have seen with this crisis is that all the elements that was digital technology has become an absolute critical infrastructure. And what was optional before? So take the example of people that can use internet for vote. It's an option. It's not mandatory. And by the way, it should be considered like that. And with COVID, number of interaction have not anymore internet as an option. That was the only way. Typically, when you were looking at interaction that were with overseas, you have no other option than to use the internet. But then we have one key element, and we need to understand how trust is established between people. I would just use a proxy for trust. is a multi-factor authentication. When you have an interaction with a human being, you hear, you listen, you feel, you look at the body language, and all that together give you a very important information. Is it real or is it fake? When you just transpose the element in the digital world, then you need to have things that are not as intuitive. So you need to trust something that you don't know. And I'm not talking about the people that are experts, but don't forget, what is important is not what you say, but what people understand. And when people don't understand what this is about, they don't know. But when they don't know, and they are forced to accept something, then you enter into a very dangerous zone. And we have seen a lot of type of cyber attacks due to the fact that people were completely lost in this environment. Now, coming back to Switzerland, one of the elements that is very special about Switzerland is in a way a small village, where there is a lot of interaction, and despite of the COVID crisis, a lot of things have still happened to be physical. And that is why I would not automatically say that everything has been bad. Simply, the need of digital element was maybe not as present. Having said that, I personally believe that to have a digital trust is something that is absolutely essential. But now I will come with something that is, as we say that in French, a little bit la palisse, is that some people think, oh, to get trust, we first need to have a security that is just outstanding. But before we consider security, we need to have something that is reliable and that we can use. And in a way, we need to have something where security is here, but invisible, and where we have something that is so user-friendly that people forget that there is a technology between different human beings. At the end, the question of trust is trust between people. Take another very simple example. When you have a meeting face-to-face, you have closed doors. When it's really confidential, you know that everyone is here and that what is happening between closed doors will happen here. When we just do that virtually, the question is the main risk people that will spy you over the internet, or somebody that will misuse the technology and do something different. And I would say that at the end, it's about people. Can you trust the people or not? And in the digital dimension, trusting people have a different meaning. And that is something that we need to be aware of. So just to say that the best technology that you can have, or the worst technology, if you don't look at the people first, you will just miss your target.
Absolutely. So thanks a lot. Indeed, the user at the center, right, and the human being at the center of what we are doing, this is absolutely crucial. So now maybe I think John, you may want to elaborate on the side of the Microsoft, after all, is a giant, and how do you see the role of the company from the point of view of further enforcing the trust and maybe bringing exactly the dimension that Nele and André have focused on, well, the crucial dimension is the perception by the citizen, by the consumer, and in such a way that the notion of trust that is very intrinsic to our species, but is also found in other species, actually, and that is a concept that is millennia old, if not more, and at the core of the social fabric, smoothly gets integrated in the digital world, considering that very tiny fraction of the population understand how it works, because virtually everyone uses it, but very few understand the protocols of the internet. Very few people understand how cryptography really works, and so on, right? By the same way that we manage to get accustomed to, you know, boarding aircrafts and making use of automobiles, while only a tiny fraction of the population understands how they operate. Well, we trust? Well, the automobile is a kind of a disaster, you have to say. But the aircraft, at least from the safety point of view, has reached a remarkable, you know, level. So how do we achieve something similar, but on a topic that is way more complicated, actually, because the internet as a whole is way more complicated than an aircraft.
Let me start with a little bit of context, which is the digital transformation that's taking place across society in every aspect of our lives, in every aspect of business, every aspect of government. This decade, technology will go from 5% of the global economy, GDP, to 10%. There's a doubling of the technology elements, the fastest growing part of the economy. And so the digital transformation taking place across all these sectors is a huge opportunity, but also a transition state. And so as a basic concept, and then part of this acceleration of digitalization is the rise of cloud computing. And so instead of having companies run data centers themselves, we've developed, you know, these sort of hyperscale data centers and tremendous advances in data sciences and artificial intelligence. So we've got this huge concentration of computation power that's accessible to everybody now. But on the business side, there's also, you know, people have to, I think, appreciate what we call stakeholder capitalism today. You know, we're not just Milton Friedman saying that the role of business is to make profit. Instead, we think of ourselves as we've got lots of constituencies to look after. You know, we need to look after our employees, talent, competing for talent, motivating talent, getting the best out of people. That's just a huge part of running a big organization. Our customers are important, but you know, also the communities we work in, and you know, the trust of government and political leaders is incredibly important. And so if you lose that trust, then you're gonna have a harder time across the board of things. So we kind of look at this multi-stakeholder trust set of issues. Now, you know, we're also a global company. So yesterday at dinner, we were talking about LinkedIn's announcement of going to, I'd call a skinny service in China. You know, it's sort of like, well, we don't want to provide services which authoritarian governments can use to repress people, right? So, you know, we're constantly making decisions about, you know, what services we'll offer to which customers in which countries, because, you know, or where to put a data center, because when we put a data center somewhere, that government has sovereignty and ability to demand access to data. So, you know, it's a multifaceted project, and you know, for us, we do use the UN guiding principles for human rights in business as just, you know, and we talk about it every week. So I think just running an organization, just appreciating that. And then I think it's also important, as we've talked, a lot of the services we've talked about today are consumer services. And I think that sometimes people don't make enough distinction between the service and the business model. And so the service may be you get to share photos. The business model is, in return for that photo sharing app, you've agreed to let a company track you everywhere you go on the internet. And, you know, sort of like, are they making money from photo business? Or are they making money from monetizing your data with advertisers? And so I think that, you know, as government, it's important to look at both sides and trying to understand that the products, you know, the services that have problems, some of that's driven by the business model as well. And that maybe we need to, you know, regulate those business models more carefully.
Thank you very much. So André, you want to have a quick intervention, then we move to Niniane and Ursula.
It was just a reaction. You don't need to be a doctor to understand how people behave. And one of the key elements, and to just come back on the question of business model, just by looking at interaction, some people may find some weak or strong points that they can suddenly create some arbitrage where you can do a lot of interesting elements. And when I'm thinking about hackers, a hacker will find some failure in the element without automatically understanding how things are built, but by looking at what can be got from the imbalance of things. And that is a very central point.
Thanks a lot, André. So maybe Niniane, you want to tell us more about the Swiss Digital Initiative. So what is the rationale actually, and to what extent actually it is a tentative to respond to the challenges that have been mentioned and discussed profusely today?
So I would like to pick up very quickly on what my previous speakers have said. So, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So what we have seen is not just a health crisis or an economic crisis, but really also a crisis of trust. So mistrust in our institutions, such as the media, science, but also in the new digital technologies. On the same hand, we have seen an acceleration of digitalization, so digital tools as potential instruments to fight a pandemic. But what we also have seen also here in Switzerland, even though the best products or services have been developed, data protection secured, etc., people didn't use, for example, when we talk about the fight against the pandemic, the Swiss COVID app. So even though everything, the multi-stakeholder approach was respected, civil society also had a word in the development of the app, academia, the decentralized approach, etc. But in the end, and I think even we talked yesterday with Nele, even in one of the most digitized countries, the contract tracing didn't work. And so the raison d'etre, I would say, of the Swiss Digital Initiative Foundation is really this question: how can we build and foster this digital trust? And I think we all agree. It might be intuitive what digital trust means, but when you look at it a bit more closely, you see it's not that easy, actually. It's a very complex question, and you can't just transfer trust from the analog world into the digital world. And I believe we don't need to be all experts in understanding to the fullest how these digital tools or services work. I mean, when we enter or when we take the plane, for example, we probably don't know the physics behind, or probably very superficially. So the question is, how can we ensure that trust is ensured, or trust is in digital tools is promoted. And we are working since 2 years, and I mean, you, Jean-Pierre, you were also closely involved on a digital trust label for users. So it has two kinds of functionalities. So first, it's kind of it's a combination between a nutrition fact table, so giving users more information in 4 categories: security, data protection, reliability, and fair user interaction, so that the users really know what is behind these digital services. On the other hand, we are guaranteeing that we checked criteria, so a certain standard is met behind this digital service. So it's this two-folded approach that should give users more transparency and help them to take more empowered decisions, and also, understand probably better. It's a tool to understand better what is behind this digital service. And today, I don't know, accepts nothing. The users is kind of lost in this digital jungle and have to trust or not trust, and that's where we come in with this label and really want to make a difference for the users.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. Yeah, the jungle indeed, that's the challenge, the digital jungle. So it'd be Ursula from so you recently joined a vibrant campus you know well. So can you give us your own insights on the topics that have been mentioned so far, and how do you react also to the contributions that have been brought to the discussion?
So for me, one of the first question is, what is the trust? Trust is a relationship between two entities. And in many cases, digital is just a channel in between, okay, which was there before. And if you look at EPFL, where students, academics, this is a beautiful example. We had to put all courses online due to COVID last year, okay? So we had to go digital. The students never really questioned the trust in the digital technology. But then it came into actually the trust between EPFL and the EPFL brand and the students, okay? Which can go down into, okay, what are we going to do with the exams? Do we have them online or do we have them in the classroom? Okay, do we trust our students or do we not trust our students that they will cheat? So there's much more to trust than just the technology. So these were major questions, I think, that all academic institutions had to do, because then it had an impact also on their brand afterwards, which again is a reference of a trust, okay? And then we had different professors who wanted to do in class, others were more afraid, had a different perception of COVID, they did not want to do in class. So the trust in this whole transition has multi facets, which makes it very complex. And on top of that, the student culture is extremely international. And from an international perspective, every culture has a different relationship to what trust means and when you can cheat, or when you don't cheat, a loyalty, and then the view on life, okay? So all of that is part of the package of the trust. But if you take this a step further, you know, the relationship between a human and a brand, okay? I trust, I don't know, this car brand, okay? And I have no problems using digital channels and digital engagement and talking to an AI person or a bot on the other side in my dialogue, because I trust the brand and I trust what they're offering me through digital channels. Then in other cases is, do I trust the other person that's speaking on the other end, okay? And again, the digital is the channel. However, then comes the point, do I trust in the technology, okay? Do I trust Google? Do I trust Microsoft? There's also a component in that. And for me, the most extreme level is then, do I trust what happens to my data, okay? Is that data my own or not? And do I trust who I give it to? So it's a very facet thing, and it's as much about the other person and both ways, you know, a brand towards an individual towards a brand, data, things, it's quite complex.
Absolutely. So thanks a lot, Ursula. So at this stage, it would be interesting to see if we already have reactions from the audiences, be it here in the room or online. So questions or comments you would like to make here? We'll start maybe with the room, yeah, maybe a specific question you may want to ask the panel, or comments on what has been mentioned so far in the room. Yeah, please. The microphone is okay. Okay, so let's start with the question in the room. Yeah, please. You want to introduce yourself, if you wish.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the panel. My name is Cécile May. I have a startup in cybersecurity awareness. Sorry. I have a question for Nele. I'm very interested about how you deal as a government, as I understand, with all this digital world where you have no choice but to go and dive in it, and you have all this regulation. And we were speaking about regulation this morning, and since you are here and you are a great and beautiful example of the government having to deal with that, I thought it would be my chance to ask you.
do you ask now how we get government to dive in the virtual world, or how do we get our public to dive there? We are still in the process. We are somewhere in the middle, but I do have to say that our history a little bit helps here, because differently from what was actually said before, in Estonia we saw more trust in digital and computers than actually the humans behind them. Because we had this slogan, you cannot bribe the computer, and actually digitalization helped to increase trust in these humans that were behind the labels or institutions. But it was, I would say, a deliberate decision to go towards that way. But at certain point, at some point on the way, it became Estonia's trademark. So now I would say that everybody is under pressure to simply go there. But why I said that we are still in the middle is, for example, when I look at our foreign service, for example, it is not still so that we all understand that, let's say, digital technologies are becoming an everyday topic of our diplomats. And I am sure that these examples exist also elsewhere, and it simply takes time. And as we have a saying, sometimes you also need to go to sauna where we solve all our issues and find a common language.
Yeah, as you understand, this sauna is actually a highly analog way to solve problems but not only in Estonia, in Finland as well, right? So, Mike, I think there was some question also online. Yeah?
Yes, thank you. This one was addressed to dear Mr. Kudelski, but I think it can open up to all of you. And it's, can we really base our choice or trust in people based on their pedigree, CV, or track record? Or how would we know, even if a company like Kudelski meets all of those, as the question is saying, how do we know if there's something like a backdoor like crypto AG, or if there's bugs that other governments can get into? And I think the questioner is looking whether certification, deeper than deep certification of the systems, is something that can help to create trust.
I would just say that we are talking about asymmetric situation. A hacker needs to be just successful once to get through. The one that have to defend has to ensure that all the chain is okay. And why I'm talking about people is that if people think that technology is perfect, you need to take into account what is a people behavior. Sometimes they may have some bad attitudes or do that on purpose, but most of the time they are just not taking care and not careful enough. And that is also an important element to say that people may be a very easy target in the system. Now, coming back to the fundamental technology, one of the approach is to ensure that the sum of the technology will give you something that is safe. And I'm just coming back to something that is very Swiss. In Switzerland, we are very used to referendum. And one of the key roles in referendum is to say that it's very difficult to add the yes. If you have people that support something for different reasons, usually it's not adding up very well. But what is adding up very well are opposition. And the story is the same about security. And we need to ensure that we have architecture and approach where just a single point of failure will not create a big issue. And I'm just taking now a very concrete example. You have, from time to time, some battle regarding encryption algorithm. You have some people say, oh, I want to have my own algorithm from this country. That may be Europe, that may be some people in America, that may be some people in China. And some people, no, I don't trust this algorithm, I want another one. And now you have to ask yourself one fundamental question. Should we use one algorithm, or should we use the combination of algorithms? Imagine that you have something that is confidential, you encrypt using algorithm A, and you add on top of that algorithm B and algorithm C. Considering that if you have one algorithm that is flooded, it will not compromise the overall solution. That's one example. But you may also imagine the opposite, is that if you have an information that is sent using the 3 different algorithms, the weaker one, if it's just in parallel, will define the security. So just to say that you need really to first understand what you have to secure and to have the appropriate architecture to defend that. Now, that can be dealt by expert, but for the end user, I would say there is one key question. What is really confidential, and to treat what is really confidential in a very secure way. The other elements take into account that everybody can listen. And that is maybe the starting point. But sorry to be so long.
Oh, thank you, Oesterle. Thank you very much, André. And actually, I will succumb to the temptation to ask another solution provider, namely Microsoft, right? So how do you reassure your customers about the fact that there are no trapdoors, there is no dirty trick in your, either in your products or in your services, right? Including, the way you store the data of the customers. I mean, there's a huge portfolio of services and that are, each of them very complex, right? And Microsoft is also an integrator, so, which means that not everything is homemade, right? You're making use of components, electronic components that also come from abroad, and so on. So how do you provide evidence that the resulting service is actually bulletproof?
Well, with the rise of cloud computing, our relationship with customers fundamentally changed. And we're largely an enterprise company. We have consumer-facing products and services, but most of our revenue comes from large companies and governments that have security people who dig in and examine things. And so our relationship changed from being supplier of software to more like a bank where we're keeping their data in our data center. So we're storing their money, their most valuable assets. So it's a different relationship. Can we be bulletproof? When we survey the world, in today's world, we can be really, really good, but we can't be perfect. And so zero trust models so that there's no single point of failure, you can build that out. But we're also, it's not just a technical issue. The biggest, most sophisticated threats to our services come from nation states. And while we can be really good at cybersecurity, can we really go up against the Russian army? Or, I think in the SolarWinds attack, there were more than 1,000 engineers in the Russian military operating that exploit. And so what we've done is, we've tried to sort of step back and look at the overall system. Why is it that nation states have offensive capabilities? And how do we shape international norms to guide them towards responsible use of their cyber capabilities? And so Brad Smith, who's an alum of this institution, 5 or 6 years ago gave a speech calling for a digital Geneva Convention. And I'm no doubt his choice of phrases was heavily influenced by the fact that he went to school here, and you can see the Red Cross flag across the way, right? And we got a lot of feedback from that, and the world's not quite there, but we stepped back and said, okay, we may not be ready for a digital Geneva Convention. But we need to shape norms of behavior of nation states in cyber. And so I think, you know, one of the critical problems we have is international humanitarian law applies during the conduct of war. But it's not clear it applies in peacetime. And so when you've got a cyber attack, is that creating a war? Or, you know, and do principles of proportionality and distinction that would be applicable in a military conflict, they should apply to protect civilians in times of peace as well. So but we've been engaging in these discussions with governments and trying to shape the overall discussion about what nation states do, while also encouraging governments to play a more active role in dealing with, like, ransomware. And so for the first time, we're seeing more active response saying, you know, you can't have a criminal franchise operation in a country where our law enforcement can't reach. And so we need governments to intervene to get the government, in this case of Russia, to deal with the cyber criminals operating with impunity inside Russia. So it's a mix of things, but clearly there's technical parts, but it's also shaping the broader context that sets the problems.
Absolutely. So thanks a lot. And it's even maybe worse than what you are describing, right? It's not just Russia. Even Western countries actually sometimes invest in cyber weaponry, right? Actually quite massively, as we well know. And so the thing is that the vested interests of countries shapes the behavior of the governments, and as a consequence can lead to pretty aggressive behavior in the cyberspace, which can then potentially get out of reach. I mean, essentially get out of control and lead to more conventional armed conflicts. So this is clearly one of the threats that comes with the digital world. So Niniane, so having you, so we'll come to Ursula in minutes, but I have just a specific question to you, Niniane, which is the following. Having heard about this asymmetry, right? It's a huge asymmetry, as André insisted on, and rightly so. How do you see the initiative that is put forward by the STI, being at some point really successful and adopted? I like very much the idea. It makes a lot of sense to help consumers to say, hey, I intend to make use of this product or this online service, let's say, but I want to be aware of what's behind it. What are the tricks, right? In an ideal world, it should be the case that we can just check as we check on a bottle of soda and so on. What is the health risk associated with this? But here we're talking about something that is way more complicated, and we have to take into account the presence of these stakeholders and actors that have huge resources. We are talking about tens of thousands, if not more, highly qualified and high-paid people who are there just to design cyber weapons. And unfortunately, as we've seen, these cyber weapons that were initially in the hands of the states end up in the hands of the organized crime, right? With the consequences we know. So consider this asymmetry. So how do you see the path towards success for this project?
Yes, so I mean, in an ideal world, the states would agree on common norms and standards, and we would all have the solutions, right? But we are not living in an ideal world, so I guess on the path towards these standards and norms, we need some kind of soft law instruments, for example. And what we have seen over the past 2 years on working on these digital trust labels, we observed very closely what is happening elsewhere in other countries, but also Switzerland, and there seems a high demand from the user for more accountability, more transparency, and more control. And how can you ensure that if it's not the state that can ensure that, but how can you ensure that? And one easy way out would be, of course, you say, okay, we are creating a label or a certification that can give some control back to the users. And I totally agree. It's a very complex, it's really complex to do that for digital services. But I think we need to start somewhere. And what we have seen, there are worldwide, I think, around 60 different initiatives and projects trying to work on some kind of a label from different, they all have different approaches. Some are just, looking at data, data protection, some just security. Then we have artificial intelligence, measurement approaches where we try, or the initiatives try to explain better what the AI is doing, etc. So we have really different stakeholders trying to find solutions. And I think what we have seen, we must start somewhere, and probably it will not be the perfect product from the very beginning. It's just a starting point. But what we have seen is that there is a high demand, and we did several user studies in Switzerland, the US, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe to see what, from the user's perspective, what do they need? And what came clearly out of this is, of course, some kind of a quality seal that would be desirable. But on the other hand, they really welcome also to get more information. So this, this nutrition table approach, where you have, okay, I know this ingredient is good and this ingredient is probably not that good, but we are not yet at the stage, I think, where we can say, okay, what does it mean when a digital services, for example, has a gold medal and a silver medal? Because how can we say what is gold, what is silver? So we are at the very beginning of this development, and I strongly believe that to start this education, this awareness, we need to start somewhere. And our approach with this digital trust label, we will launch it officially at the beginning of 2022. All information will be online before, and then we will see how it will be perceived, but we see it more as a starting point and not as the end point of a product that it will be set in stone.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Niniane. Also because it is a highly evolving environment, right? Things are moving at tremendous speed, so one will have to catch up in a way or another. Ursula, you wanted to intervene about what was said previously, I guess. Yeah, please.
I was just coming from the other side on the bulletproof cyber. There's also the term of agreement that was made between the user and the company. And for example, when you have a startup, often you have a term of agreement what they will do with the data. And the moment they get acquired by a corporate, those rules aren't there anymore. And you never signed up for that kind of agreement. And so there's a shift in that. Or the agreement on social media, where there's supposed to be a freedom of expression, okay? I'm not talking about abuse, but at least certain freedom of exchange of thoughts. And now it's censored based on criteria that come from governments. I mean, that damages trust in a lot of these things too that have really developed in the last year. So it's both sides, the cyber attacks on the one side, but also the change of terms of agreement.
Thanks a lot. That's indeed a very crucial dimension. André, you want to add something? Yeah, please.
Just 2 points. First element, and I would just try to rebound on this question of agreement between the company and the end user. I think that where we may have a missing part is to consider that the term of agreement regarding data is something that is independent of who is the owner of the company that is processing the data. In a way, to say that the contracts regarding how the data can be used should be linked with the data and not by the owner of the company that is processing them. Now, just regarding one more time the question of business model. Many people think about nation states doing attacks, but you may imagine a much more perverse business model. Imagine that you have some criminal organization that do develop some tools to attack, to make money, and that the nation state is tolerating that and get some attack free of charge in exchange of tolerating that. So don't forget, technology is a tool, but if you have the right business model, you can really do incredible things. If you have a positive mind, you can do great things. If you have a satanic mind, you can do also incredible things, but in the same way.
Such is our species, yeah, as we know. Thank you. So you wanted Nele to intervene at this stage.
Yes,
yeah.
I wanted also to refer to the bulletproof of digital society. And when coming back to the trust, what I see that perhaps the discourse of several governments, perhaps at the beginning, was really targeted at trying to explain that the digital world is so secure. But it has been perhaps a little bit wrong also from the government side. And we have seen that discourse changing in Estonia, where we have really become open with all the risks and things that may go wrong. But it hasn't really influenced the trust and all the cyber attacks that we have also mentioned here. And with Michael, we talked about this example in summer when Estonia had the biggest ID card crisis. 1/3 of our population had to change the ID card because of the technological mistake. And we as, from government, I was then not in the government, but I could see that there was a fear that it might now influence the trust of digitalization. But it did not. Absolutely nothing changed because people were used to living in the virtual world and they had also realized that these things may happen. But the other side comment I wanted to say is actually about the cyber attacks and the wars and everything that we have talked, and of course they get a lot of international attention. But when we look at our government's everyday life, then the hacking is domestic largely. Which puts, of course, the security and the financing and everything higher on the table, but we cannot forget that we have our own people who also want to have some fun.
Well, maybe Estonia prides itself to also have excellent hackers, right? Why not? Yeah, absolutely. Very good. So maybe it's time to take additional questions and comments from the audience, be it locally or remotely. How do we stand on the internet? Michael, is still someone watching from outside?
Yes, there's still questions. I think the same questioner not fully satisfied with the answer about whether certifications and whether making the systems more secure and comparing it to civil aviation is the way to go, rather than, in one example, a treaty, where he's wondering whether attribution is possible and what is the potential risk of misattribution. So it's kind of like, is it better to try and defend and deter the attacks, or have a treaty that allows for retaliation, I suppose?
Why choose?
That's not my question. But is it possible with certification and other ways to increase the level of security?
Absolutely. I mean, certifications are incredibly important because it is, you know, it's a lifetime of a product and service. It's not just when you ship it. That's always the day you're happiest with your product. And it, you know, over time, that's when vulnerabilities become exposed. But you know, do have an ongoing process to keep a product secure and your customers secure over time. And so the certifications are incredibly important at the beginning and over the life cycle.
Yeah, very good. More feedbacks on this, maybe.
I would just say that's one point, but I would just use two key points. First one is to have a right architecture. And one of the issues is number of systems have not been designed to be secure by design. And that has been the start of the issue. But the second element, and to take the example of aviation. In aviation, you know what are the challenges that you have. Typically, if you have a tornado, if you have bad weather, it's something that you may model. So the issue is, in cyber attack, you have some clever people that try to beat the system and try to bring that outside of its comfort zone. And that's a fundamental difference. So certification may help, but you will have people by design that will try to beat the certification process.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. That is crucial, and that's of course the distinctive factor of digital trust that we are talking about. Actually, a threat that is man-made, and as we know, this is the worst because creativity is at work, and so in contrast with weather, that can indeed be modeled, and that is not by itself evil. Well, as you were mentioning, satanism can lead to behavior that are immensely, let's say, that have very severe consequences, and they try by design to be non-detectable and unpredictable. That's exactly the issue. Do you have more questions online, Michael, or is it, or maybe from the room? Yes, please. You want to introduce yourself, if you wish?
Yes. I'm Mariana Mendez. I'm a student at the Graduate Institute. I'm doing my master's. And my question is, because we were mentioning about public-private partnership between the government and the companies, but how can we ensure that companies can trust the governments? Because as we saw in the COVID crisis, the suppliers were very afraid of governments taking like their supplies of, for example, face masks. It happened a lot in Mexico. I'm from Mexico. So how can we ensure that, like in the international level, we can take better decisions, but, I mean, the trust between governments and the private sector? Thank you.
Okay, that's a very broad question that even goes beyond the issue of digital, because that the trust between governments and the private sector, citizens, and let's say between the government and citizens is well, it's been actually at the core of human history for many centuries. So, but maybe we should narrow it down to the topic of the panel. So, how would you see it, dear panelists? What exactly, if in terms of the potential lack of trust, and this is actually happening in practice again and again, that the private sector has to operate to its business and try to develop and so on, while being under the supervision and to some extent being potentially affected by decisions of the government that in some cases, especially in crisis situation, might be highly adversarial. So I know who would like to André, you seem to be highly motivated by the question.
I have a little bit of fun because you have a very interesting study that shows that in many countries, companies are much more trusted than governments. And that may be exactly the reason. So if short-term, a company may have a downside to get some trouble with the government, long-term, they will deserve the trust because they are more trusty.
Yeah, this is something that is known to be the case, including, I think, in the US. So I guess, John, you will agree with the fact that the population tends to trust more, let's say, companies, including large corporations such as Microsoft, but also Google to some extent, more than the government. It's probably a bit less the case here, also because the web giants are domestic in the US, but they are foreign in Switzerland. So that's also a dimension that has to be taken into account. And that also, we have seen, right, the fact that here in this country, the population has rejected massively the proposal for the electronic identity, while most of the people probably happily authenticate themselves through Google and Facebook. Online, so there might be a kind of a contradiction here. So that, I think, is really the core of the tensions between the. I think was there another question in the room? Yes. Yes. No. Yes. Here. Voilà. Parfait.
Thank you. My name is Philippe Stoll. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross. So, Mr. Frank, don't worry, I'm not going to come into the discussion about the Digital Geneva Convention. It's much more about a statistic that I saw, and I don't know what to do with it, in the sense that a younger generation, and I saw this was in the US, one teenager out of 5 has a best friend, or consider their best friend someone they never met. And this is for me something I don't know how to put it in my scheme of thought on what is going to, how it's going to impact our way to trust people, but also to trust machines or to trust. So it's not really a question, I have to say, but much more like throwing something at you, and maybe since we have great minds around on this stage, that you have ideas that could help us also to figure out.
Okay, so the meeting online as opposed to meeting in person. So who wants to? And that's a sociological issue, and the fact also. But you may want to maybe on purpose you refrain from doing that. But we might also say about the fact that dating activities tend to be more and more mediated by the internet. Which means that finding, partners occurs and will probably more and more occur based not, let's say, on the emotional side of discovering, someone who is for some reason desirable, but more as a result of filters, right, that are put on profiles. So that's a big change. That's a big change for mankind as a whole. So, and clearly, I mean, EPFL, most of the population are students, and clearly we see that their behavior is different than the one we had when we were their age. There's absolutely no question about that. So, who wants to respond to this indeed crucial issue of the impact on the young generation behavior? Because, and also put it into perspective with respect to the notion of trust, because meaning the fact that they become friends or partners in a relationship and so on involves, of course, a certain level of trust. It's impossible to be a friend with someone without trusting that person, of course. So who wants to respond to this relatively broad and somewhat sociological issue?
Can I just take
you want to try, John?
Cut at it, which is, I do think that the social values of technology should reflect the society's values, right? And I think, and I do think that those of us who create technologies and put them out in the world, we have to understand how they're actually being used in the world. And we need to own up to the negative aspects and try to address those. And some technologies, people may think it's a great thing that's going to change the world in a positive way, and they just want to ignore all the negative stuff that it causes. And I think you have to own up to both. So I think that, it's a little different than the question you asked, but I think the societal aspects, we are changing. Society's evolving really quickly because of technology. And so it is really important for us to understand and observe and be sensitive to the social dynamics that we're creating.
Absolutely. So maybe Ursula, you want to respond to this, yeah?
So a couple of points. The first is, the friends you search online, you tend to be more like-minded to you, so at the same values and the same thinking. And there we have a general issue of what does that mean, in diversity and looking at things differently. Because by being in a classroom or in a community of much more diversity, online you search communities that are partners or friends that are much more like you. So it's a sense of simplicity, it's a sense of feeling part of it, but it diminishes your horizon of thing. You can also spin that a little bit further and kind of say, okay, as we go towards personal assistant or my personal kind of like digital twin in it that shadows me, when that person gives you recommendation and kind of manages you in your life and starts to understand you better than your spouse, then what, okay? Because then you build a closer trust and relationship to your digital image or your digital, versus to your spouse. Now, on the other side, if you kind of have a digital reference, a digital image of your spouse, and on your way home, you know, this digital image kind of says, oh, your spouse had a bad day, and then you do a stop and get some flowers or whatever, or a bottle of wine on the way home, it has a positive impact, okay? So it's always how to use these things, but I agree, in the end, it has to kind of reflect the social values of society.
Okay, very good. Nele, we wanted to comment on this as well.
Yeah, we got a very nice social science insight into it, but just what it means for government is actually that we have to go where the people are. So for government, it's a confirmation that they really need to start to reach people in the digital if they are not already doing it. But I have also, of course, thought about the same question, but then came COVID. And I wasn't that worried anymore, because it seemed to me that COVID kind of proved that we actually miss also the physical interaction and behavior, and we have heard of the not so positive or merry news of how this not having physical contact actually has impacted the mental health of especially of our youth. So I guess they still need to hang around also.
I think there's no question about that. So indeed, one just needs to witness what is happening and the density of population that can be observed in bars populated by youngsters. Well, indeed, there is a need, absolutely. Do you have more questions? Maybe, Michael, is there some question online, or we are exhausted the
there's
batch?
Another one.
And
then there was one there too, but...
Okay. So maybe why don't we take, as a matter of fairness between the audiences, we take one online and then we come back to the room.
Okay. So this is from Mike Nelson, who's with the Carnegie Endowment. I used to teach forecasting, futuring, and scenario planning at Georgetown. The COVID crisis has accelerated our shift to the cloud. What scenarios, good or bad, can you imagine that could help or hinder development of trust in the digital economy?
Wow, okay. So who would like to respond to this? That's a fairly broad and open question, but so John, you want to try?
Well, events happen. And so in the United States, there was an oil pipeline that was subject to a ransomware attack, and it caused a gasoline shortage on the East Coast of the United States for a few days. And that really got the attention folks in the political world in Washington, D.C. It was finally it was surprising that that's the thing that broke through. But it is those kind of events that trigger government action to move things forward. So there's more things that are going to happen along the way. With our dependence on everything being digital, we just have more digital vulnerability.
Absolutely, yeah. And indeed, the example, I think, is really one that has probably had the tremendous impact on the American perception, right? What can be more traumatizing than running out of gas, right? That must be awful. So, André, you want to make a comment on this, and then we'll take a question from the audience.
You need sometimes some Hiroshima to have people being really aware of something. Now, I will just ask a question, and that is quite a perverse question. What is more efficient if you look from the eyes of a hacker to cyber attack an hospital, or something different that will not just harm the ones that are already in bad shape, but will create millions of people that will need to go in the hospital? And in this way, and that is very interesting to look at COVID, because COVID is in a way, how to say, a live thing that have tried to really manage its own survival and have used intelligence in an innovative way to attack humankind. And we may imagine that some hacker may get some idea out of what COVID has done.
Okay, let's hope they're not as successful. Very good. Thanks, André. Okay, let's take a question maybe from the audience.
Good afternoon, Dirk Kalper from the Analytics think tank. First of all, thank you very much for this discussion. The digital space is 30 years old, roughly. We moved from a geographically centric to an open space environment. And up to today, that space architecture has been enabled by private companies or governments through regulations. And my question is, do you think that one day we will have a people, or let's say individual-centric, let's say environment in the digital space, where maybe new tools which are supranational, like let's say a personal wallet with your, let's say, medical records, or maybe your financial records, could be used for the individual to leverage that digital space. So it's really that shift from, let's say, a geographically centric and open space, which might require new tools that we do not have yet, that neither the private sector nor governments can provide. I just want to have your views on that angle. Thank you.
Okay, so from national and local to something that is supranational is something that is an old dream of mankind that so far has not really materialized. Although some progress has been made, we have to rejoice about that. So who want to rebound on this and comment on this, let's say, potential trend? Is going to happen or not? First crystal ball exercise, and there is going to be a few more in the coming minutes. Nele, yeah.
I actually thought that it's already in place.
To some extent, yeah.
Yes, I see. I think it's to some extent in place, but definitely.
It's called actually Visa and Mastercard, right?
Yes, but there is still a strong private sector interest behind it. But I see like two developments here that may also push for it. And one actually is also that was reawakened after the COVID crisis, and that was related to the realization that we as governments and people and organizations, we are quite similar actually. We have our similar problems and issues that we need to attend to, and that little bit now differs from when I started in digitalization, where we all thought we are so different, we all need different developments, we need to, I'm just an example, we need an ID system for this ministry and that ministry and then for this government. But now I see that this is actually blurring, and there is quite a big philosophy behind reuse, sharing, and rebuilding on something that is already existing, even though this is not entirely in response to what were you asking. But when we now think of, and I believe that was a little bit discussed in the previous panel also, was actually what when we look now at the person, there is quite a bit of data, let's say, being collected by every individual. And that data is somewhere scattered around. And the people are not the ones that are currently profiting from this data. There is, of course, government data that the government is opening up, and the private sector and people are profiting. But all the data that is somewhere spreading around by Google, Facebook, you name it, this is sort of still not organized. Like how now to get that data and start using it, and that is definitely a possibility for every individual to start to be a master of its data and start learning from it.
Very good, thanks a lot. Yeah, maybe Ursula, you want to comment on this, and then we'll move to the last, let's say, round of, let's say, contributions, because we are just at 10 minutes left. Yeah.
So I think we're in the midst of this battle because digital has no physical boundaries, and there's a competition at different global centered companies trying to go for this, and there are multiple entry points. So the WHO, just for example, the WHO with its vaccination passport or health passport, when we go towards globalized currencies, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or potentially the central currency, those are all entry points. And once you have a financial wallet or a health passport, all kinds of things can build on it. And we're in the midst of this battle. I don't know who's going to win. I don't know how it's going to pay out, but we're in the absolute middle of it. But it has massive implications on citizens' rights, trust who you trust and who you don't trust, and how information is shared.
Very good, thanks a lot. So as mentioned, we have a little time left, but there's one thing that I would like to, unless there is a super pressing question, Otherwise, I would like to hear from the panel their reaction about the following thing. So we have talked about COVID and its impact, the fact that it has accelerated the digitalization, which is indeed a fact. But there's another dimension, which is that technology doesn't stop. And so if we project ourselves, let's say, 10 years ahead of now, right? So 2031, so in 10 years from now, the amount of progress that is going to be made by, machine learning, right? And large-scale hoarding of data combined with the Internet of Things, right, is very difficult to grasp. I mean, it means that very soon there's going to be the ability to make a number of decisions and a number of reasonings that go far beyond what human beings are able to do, right? So in some specific areas, computers are going to just be better than us, right? And we've already seen this with games, right? With chess, Jeopardy, Go, and so on. But it's going to be way, way more than that. So, of course, there have been failures, right? But all in all, this progress seems to be unstoppable, which means that the level of complexity will also increase tremendously. And clearly, in spite of all the efforts of EPFL and the likes, the level of preparation of the population will not be able to follow that pace. I think we cannot hope. We have to try, but the population as a whole will not be able to follow and to cope with the pace of evolution of technology. This, I think, is a relatively safe prediction, right? So how do you see digital trust evolving, taking this immense evolution that is ahead of us into account, and taking into account the fact that there's going to be more things that are going to emerge from the digital world that are unpredictable. For example, Facebook is something, or Bitcoin are things that have emerged out of the internet and that have very far-reaching consequences and that were unpredictable, right? And so more is going to happen, right? So how do we make sure, or at least increase the likelihood that trust is not going to vanish, and which could lead us to the worst possible scenario? So how do we guarantee that this is going to be for the benefit of mankind and not for its own self-destruction? So who would like to respond to this? Why don't we go in order back, maybe starting from Ursula, if you don't mind. Voilà. So just, voilà. After all, you work at EPFL, so we are, educating the people who are going to bring this kind of tremendous evolution, right? So how do we cope with this challenge?
From a user perspective, I think a lot more of the security and a lot of these things have to go into the back end and become invisible, okay? Because it's just overwhelmed. And there's been a shift. For a while it was better, but the last 5 or so years it's gotten, with all the hackings and all the scams, and so it's gotten very difficult for the user. So I think technology will work on both ends, complexity, but also simplification of complexity. So I think there has to be a major, major shift in there. But then I also think, who do we trust? Today, you don't know anymore who to trust. I mean, it's where does information come from? What's behind it? Is it real, not real? It's very difficult, mainstream or not mainstream. So I think there's also that element. And this, for me, then also leads to the social contract. And I think this is where we have to reframe. What's your social contract between you and the government, between you and the corporates, okay? And between you and other players. And this is especially sensitive when it comes to your personal data, your digital DNA trace that you leave in there. Just who owns that? If you go into the social media companies own it and they commercialize it, okay? So we've lost control of it. That's gone feral. But as we put more health data, maybe financial data, more emotions, as your emotions get digitalized, who owns that? And this is for me then the social contract. Can you give the ownership back to the citizen? Is that person capable to actually manage that? Because with that, the ownership comes responsibility, accountability, understanding. So for me, it's a two-sided thing. Technology will evolve to simplify, but then the social contract.
Voilà. Very good. Thanks a lot. So voilà, social contract versus a super AI. So André, well, maybe 1 minute if you want.
I would take two completely contradicting scenarios. One, take a computer of the early 70s, impossible to use. To make a computer something that people have adopted, you need to have something that is intuitive and very user-friendly. And in a way, I think that we'll get the same evolution regarding trust. People will trust the system that will give them an idea of good trust. Now, I have another element that is a much more negative scenario, and the history have shown us that if you have governments or some entities that are really challenged by a new technology, they will take measures to still keep the things under control. That is how, following the industrial revolution, you have had a backlash regarding globalization. So you may have a risk, and the two are not in opposition. You may have a combination of the two elements where at least few governments will really look to take control of that.
Thank you very much. So Niniane, please. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to predict the future, but when we think that only in 2007 the iPhone was introduced, so it was really not a long time ago, and has already shifted by then. And second, another element that probably will also come into play is the geopolitical race within digital technology. So how this will influence how we will use new technology as well. But I believe that we should not, be negative and say, okay, let's resign. We won't have control, we won't have power. But on the other hand, yes, there will be changes, but I think we need to start now and be prepared. And I believe that the societies that are able to take the population with them, the societies and the people with them, they will be at the forefront. And that's why I think that education is key. I mean, we don't have the perfect solution, but probably education is one key pillar of this evolution.
Great, thanks a lot. So John and then Nele, 1 minute each, please. Yeah.
Very briefly, the biggest social problems we face, like climate change, aren't going to get solved without the advances that we're making in data science and artificial intelligence. We're going to need these tools. And so I think we need to just understand that it's going to be fundamental to the major social challenges. But companies, I think, need to be more focused on creating value and not just wealth, and be responsible for the technologies they create. Governments, I think, need to do much better job of protecting the people. Emmanuel Macron has been the most, I think, articulate on this about, a government that protects. And I think that we're not going to citizens are not going to understand all these things. Governments have to do a much better job of understanding this, investing and protecting people.
Thanks a lot. So Nele, the last 60 seconds are for you.
Thank you. I would conclude actually basing on my co-panelists, and I see actually the role of geopolitics increasing, especially when we talk about data and data economy and AI, and here I see also an increasingly need for partnerships to guarantee that these knowledge and skills of these technological trends that we need for our governments, for educational sector, for our economy, that these skills also reach our countries. And here I see the biggest challenge for the future.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks a lot. So we have to wrap up. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks a lot to the audience also for their very active participation, be it in the room or online. Thank you very much for being with us for this panel.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. It's time to wrap up the day. Thanks a lot to all of you again, and thanks to the audience. I will just take this opportunity to thank the organization and technical team. Perfect job, everything went smoothly, and thanks a lot also to the Graduate Institute to host us.